It's 11:14 on a Sunday night, and there you are in bed, doing the numbers again. Not because something blew up. Nothing blew up. You're just staring into the dark, running the same calculations you ran last Sunday and the Sunday before that. Mortgage, car payment, student loans, groceries, trying to figure out whether this is the month you finally get ahead or whether you're going to keep barely staying afloat like you have for the last 3 years. You already know the answer. You've known the answer. But you keep doing the math anyway, because the other option is admitting this may just be what life feels like now. Meanwhile, your neighbor, same block, bought at about the same time, similar house, not some wildly different salary, woke up last Tuesday and decided to take the week off. No emergency. No long email to his boss. He just didn't feel like working, so he didn't. And here's the part that stings. He isn't richer than you. He's just not running those numbers anymore. My name is Nick, and I spend an unreasonable amount of time thinking about why two people with nearly identical circumstances can wind up living completely different lives. Today we're talking about something the personal finance world does a terrible job explaining. What really changes with your money, your job, your mind, and your actual day-to-day life the moment you make that final mortgage payment. And I promise, by the time this is over, that Sunday night math problem is going to look totally different. Because here's the part nobody tells you when you're 12 years into a 30-year mortgage. When it's finally gone, you don't just lose a bill. You lose a prison sentence. You stopped realizing you were serving. So let's start with the numbers, because the math here is harsher than most people understand. In both directions. The average monthly mortgage payment in 2025 reached $2,329, and that's only principal and interest, nothing else. For somebody who bought or refinanced at current rates, $2,845 is much closer to real life. Now, the median American household brings home about $5,400 a month after taxes, Social Security, and Medicare. Which means on a median income, a normal mortgage payment is eating 43% of your disposable income before you buy a single grocery or make a single car payment. 43%. The threshold basically every financial professional on earth agrees on is 28%. So most people with a mortgage are living 15 percentage points over the line every month for 30 years. Congratulations. You are technically a functioning adult who also agreed to be slowly financially strangled until you're 63. Here's what that looks like for the Garcias. A perfectly ordinary dual-income household making $110,000 a year, which sounds pretty solid until you run it through what life actually costs. After federal taxes, state taxes, FICA, and a modest 401k contribution, they're bringing home around $6,800 a month. Now watch how fast it disappears. Mortgage on their $380,000 house, $2,400. Property taxes, homeowners insurance, and maintenance, because the HVAC doesn't care that it's December, $900. That's $3,300 a month just to legally occupy the building. They've got $3,500 left. 2 car payments because they both commute, $800. Car insurance, $240. Gas, because nothing in their suburb is walkable, $280. Student loans, because those degrees didn't pay for themselves, $550. Health insurance premiums their employer only partly covers, $380. Groceries for 2 adults trying to eat like grown-ups, $700. Utilities, electricity, gas, water, internet, phones, $420. That leaves them with $130, and we still haven't touched clothes or the kids' activities or the $80 copay from last month's urgent care visit, or the dog that suddenly started limping, or any savings, or any retirement beyond that modest 401k, or any version of fun. The Garcias are not reckless. They don't own a boat. They've never taken a trip to Europe. They are two professional adults who did what they were told to do, and every financial decision they make, every career conversation, every request for flexibility, every time one of them thinks about going back to school or starting something on the side, gets filtered through one quiet question. Can we still cover the mortgage? That question sits in the background of their lives like a browser tab they can never close. That tab vanishes the day the mortgage gets paid off. And when it does, something the Garcias can barely picture right now starts to happen. They begin making totally different decisions. We'll get to that in a second. First, let's talk about what actually opens up when the mortgage disappears. Because people get this wrong all the time, in both directions. They either underestimate the impact or overestimate how much cash they'll have. When the mortgage payment goes away, you do not suddenly have the full amount available to invest. Property taxes, insurance, and maintenance are still there. On a $400,000 home, you're looking at around $838 a month in ongoing costs, even with no mortgage. So if your payment was $2,845, what you really freed up is about $2,000 a month in usable money, not $2,845. About $2,000, which is still, and I want to be exact here, absolutely wild in terms of what it can do over time. If you take that $2,000 and put it into a plain S&P 500 index fund, earning the historical average of around 8% a year, here's what happens. In 5 years, $146,000. In 10 years, $365,000. In 15 years, $693,000. In 20 years, $1,177,000. You contributed $480,000 of your own money over those 20 years. The market added another $697,000 on top of that, more than you put in yourself. Most of your eventual wealth came from compound interest, not from grinding harder. This is the part of the mortgage payoff story nobody tells you in the bank office when you're signing 30 years of paperwork. They are, shockingly, not going to mention that their product is keeping you from $1.1 million. Now, before I go further, I need to deal with the argument a certain kind of person is already typing in the comments. And that argument goes, Nick, if your mortgage rate is below 5%, you are mathematically better off investing the extra money than prepaying principal. And look, that argument is not wrong. Let me give you the honest version. Wharton professor Michael Roberts ran the numbers on a $500,000 mortgage at 3%. And found that investing extra payments in the stock market beat early payoff in about 95% of historical 30-year periods. The logic is straightforward. A guaranteed 3% return from eliminating debt loses to a historical 8% return from stocks. About 82% of current mortgage holders have rates below 5% right now. So if that's you, the spreadsheet says invest the difference. Here's what the spreadsheet does not know. It assumes you actually invest the difference. Most people don't. They spend it. The mortgage payment was forced savings. When it disappears and turns into discretionary cash, an alarming share of households let it dissolve into lifestyle creep within 18 months and have nothing to show for it. The spreadsheet also assumes you have the psychological toughness to watch your investment portfolio fall 40% in a market crash, while you still owe $2,500 a month in mandatory housing payments, which is a totally different experience from watching that same portfolio fall 40% while living in a house you own free and clear. One situation is uncomfortable. The other situation is why people make catastrophic decisions under pressure. And here's the thing the invest the difference crowd never mentions. You've been making every major financial decision of your adult life while carrying this debt. According to actual peer-reviewed research, debt measurably impairs cognitive functioning. You have literally been making the should I pay off the mortgage or invest decision from a cognitively compromised state. So maybe adjust your math accordingly. At mortgage rates above 7%, which is most people who bought since 2022, aggressive payoff becomes a very competitive guaranteed return that is hard to argue against. Between 4.5% and 7%, it's a real judgment call. Below 4.5%, invest the difference, but only if you will actually invest it and not quietly turn it into better takeout habits. The real answer, as usual, is not a rate. It's knowing yourself. Let me go back to the psychology research, because there's something here the personal finance world tends to blow past and shouldn't. A 2019 study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences tracked what happened when people had their debts eliminated, not reduced, eliminated. Anxiety dropped. Not a little, but from 78% of participants showing clinical symptoms down to 53%. That's a 25-point drop in diagnosable anxiety just from closing debt accounts. People made better decisions, not just felt better about their decisions, but actually performed better on cognitive tests. They became measurably less impulsive, less likely to chase the short-term reward at the expense of the long-term outcome. But here's the finding that stopped me cold. The number of debt accounts closed mattered more than the dollar amount of relief. Closing a $3,000 credit card created more psychological improvement than getting a $5,000 debt partially reduced. The brain doesn't care about the dollar amount. It cares about the open tab. And for most people who fought their way through credit cards, car payments, and student loans, the mortgage is the last open tab, the final thing humming in the background. When it closes, the refrigerator you stopped hearing finally goes quiet. Northwestern researchers separately found that carrying high debt-to-asset ratios correlates with measurably higher blood pressure, higher rates of depression, and worse self-reported health, even after controlling for income. This is not a metaphor. The mortgage is not just a financial obligation. It is a physiological one. Your body has been carrying it, and when it's gone, your body notices. Here's where it gets really interesting, and this is the part I think about the most. When the Garcia's mortgage disappears, let's say they paid it off aggressively in year 22 instead of year 30, which is completely achievable, their monthly expense floor drops by $2,000. In FIRE math, which is just the formula saying you need 25 times your annual expenses to be financially independent, removing $24,000 a year in mandatory costs cuts their financial independence number by $600,000. They didn't earn more money. They didn't get promoted or launch a company. They just changed what survival costs, and that number determines everything. When your monthly survival requires both incomes running at full capacity, neither person can afford to leave a job they hate, take a pay cut to do something meaningful, start a business that needs 18 months to become profitable, ask for a schedule that doesn't wreck their health, or do anything that might threaten the income feeding the mortgage. You are financially indentured, not because you're weak, but because the math requires it. So the mortgage is a 30-year employment contract you signed without realizing it. Academic research, published in 2020, found that improved housing security led to significant increases in business formation, especially among women and non-white entrepreneurs who are disproportionately affected by financial exposure. A separate study found that leveraged homeownership, meaning carrying a mortgage, significantly reduces entrepreneurship, with the strongest effect showing up when loan-to-value ratios are highest. The mechanism is exactly what you'd expect. Every dollar trapped in a mandatory monthly payment is a dollar that cannot absorb risk anywhere else. So what does the Garcia's life look like in year 22 with the mortgage gone? Mrs. Garcia stops running every career conversation through the question of whether this job is stable enough to cover the payment. She takes the role with more meaning and slightly lower pay, because now they can afford the difference. Mr. Garcia starts the contracting business he's been talking about since 2021 because one bad quarter no longer means they lose the house. They're not rich. Their income didn't change, but their decisions changed completely because the math changed completely. Now, a brief moment of honesty, because I promised you real numbers and not the fantasy version. The house is not actually free once the mortgage is paid off. I know. You were hoping I'd let you keep that one. But property taxes are not going anywhere. They've gone up 27% nationally since 2019. If you live in New Jersey, you're paying $743 a month on a median home, mortgage or not. Your house is basically paying rent to the state, whether you owe a bank or not. Homeowners insurance has jumped 52% since 2020 because apparently the atmosphere is trying to get its money back. And the 1% annual maintenance rule, which means budgeting 1% of your home's value each year for repairs, still applies, which on a $400,000 home is $333 a month set aside for the water heater that will choose 11 p.m. on Christmas Eve to announce its retirement. Add it up, and your paid-off home still costs about $838 a month nationally to own, closer to $1,300 in high-tax states. So the disappearing $2,845 payment does not hand you $2,845 to invest. It hands you about $2,000 in new freedom, which, as we've established, compounds into more than $1 million in 20 years. But plan around the real number. Because the gap between I thought I'd have $2,845 and I actually have $2,000 is exactly the size of a November property tax bill that will absolutely ruin your week if you weren't expecting it. Let's talk about who actually gets there, because the demographics tell a story worth sitting with. About 40% of owner-occupied homes in the U.S. are now mortgage-free, an all-time high. Sounds encouraging. Then you look at who those people are. 63% of homeowners 65 and older are mortgage-free, versus fewer than 28% of working-age homeowners. The average payoff age is 58 to 63. Meanwhile, the median first-time homebuyer age just hit 36. A 30-year mortgage starting at 36 doesn't end until 66, 3 years into what used to be called retirement. And here's the number that genuinely unsettles me. In 1989, 3% of homeowners over 80 still had a mortgage. Today, nearly a third do. The share of 65 to 79-year-olds still carrying mortgages has climbed from 24% to 41% in 30 years. Median mortgage debt among seniors is up 400%. We are dragging housing debt into retirement on a scale that has never happened before in American history. And we're doing it quietly, like it's normal, like it's fine. It is not fine. Only 23% of all Americans are completely debt-free. No mortgage, no car payment, nothing. Which means what we're talking about today is genuinely rare. Rare enough that when people cross that finish line, they consistently report something they couldn't have predicted. It's not just relief. It's a kind of silence they didn't realize was missing. So how do you speed this up? Because the math on getting there 5 or 8 years earlier is more compelling than most people ever run. On a $450,000 mortgage at 6.5%, your standard payment is $2,844 a month. Total interest over 30 years, $573,840. You pay more in interest than the house originally cost. Sit with that. The bank is going to collect more from you in interest alone than the full value of the house you bought. It's a beautiful business model if you're the bank. Bi-weekly payments. cutting your monthly payment in half and paying every 2 weeks. Sounds like accounting trivia until you realize it creates 13 full payments a year instead of 12. That one move, which costs you nothing in lifestyle, cuts 5 to 6 years off the loan and wipes out more than $119,000 in interest. One extra payment per year, $119,000 gone. Throwing an extra $500 a month at principal shortens the timeline by around 8 years and kills $150,000 in interest. Even an extra $1,000 a month nearly cuts the loan term in half to 17 years. None of these are heroic sacrifices. They're the difference between paying off your house at 55 versus 63, and the life you get to live at 55 with no mortgage versus the one you're still living at 63 waiting for it to end is, based on everything we've covered, not a small difference. So let's land this. What do you actually do on the day the final payment clears? First, verify that your lender filed the lien release and that you received your deed. This is the most boring sentence in the video, and also the most important one to remember, because lenders occasionally just don't file it. You find out 3 years later when you try to sell the house and discover you don't legally own what you've been paying for. I file this under things that are both tedious and essential, which describes most of adult life. Second, before you redirect a single dollar, rebuild your emergency fund. You've been house poor for years. Your reserves are almost definitely thinner than they should be. Get 6 to 12 months of your new, lower expenses in liquid savings before you do anything ambitious. Then finally, deploy the former payment in order. Max the 401k match first, because that's a 50 to 100% guaranteed return, and nothing else on this list comes close. Max the Roth IRA. $7,000 a year in 2025 grows completely tax-free. The IRS never touches the gains. Max the 401k contribution limit, $23,500. Fund an HSA if you're eligible. Then pour everything left into a taxable brokerage account with low-cost index funds. At $2,000 a month through all of these at 8%, you're at $365,000 in a decade and $1.17 million in 20 years. Not because you did anything clever, but because you survived the mortgage, closed the last tab, and finally gave compound interest the room it needed to do what it was always going to do if you had just gotten the bank out of the way. Here's what I actually want you to take from this. The mortgage was not just a large bill. It was a permission slip you had to silently ask for every time you wanted to do something different with your life. Want to leave a job you hate? Better check whether you can still cover the mortgage. Want to start something risky? Better make sure the mortgage is protected first. Want to take a pay cut to do work that matters? You can't. The mortgage. For most people, for most of their adult lives, the mortgage is the invisible hand shaping nearly every major decision they make. Not the only hand, but the one with the tightest grip. When it's gone, the grip loosens. That's what the Garcias discover in year 22. That's what every person who gets there reports. Not that they suddenly became wealthy, though compounding handles that over time, but that they can finally make decisions based on what they actually want, instead of what the mortgage demands. That's the change nobody talks about. That's the one that matters most. So that Sunday night math you've been doing in the dark, you are not going to do it forever. But the people who get to stop doing it earliest aren't the ones who earned the most. They're the ones who understood what the finish line was really worth and ran toward it on purpose.